Welcome back to the Spiderforest Webcomic Podcast. I'm Mathieu Moyen. In this episode, in it for the long haul. Webcomics are projects that take a long time to complete, often many years. Sustaining interest in a project like that over such a long time is a real challenge, as life, money, health, and simple boredom can all conspire against you. How do you overcome these obstacles and keep your eyes on your goal? To discuss this, first, Eva has an interview with Katherine Jameson, creator of the comic Age of Clay. Then I'll be back for a discussion with Jen Zyren Smith of the comic LaSalle's Legacy, Sophie Pfrötzschner of the comic Soul's Journey, and Kristen Kiomall-Evans of the comic 12 of Magic and Muses. We're going to get through this together, so stay with us.
Hey, I'm Eva and I make a comic called Bits Fair. A few months ago, a comic I've been following for the last few years, Age of Clay, drew to a close. It's a sci-fi fantasy story about a young girl living in an impossible garden. I've really enjoyed reading it, and after the last chapter went up online, I rushed to interview its author, Katherine Jameson. I started off by asking her about the origin story of her comic.
It really just kind of came about because I was reading a lot of heady sci-fi, Philip K. Dick and Ursula Le Guin, and I really wanted to experiment with just kind of fun literary things to try out with a comic with a good dose of semi-adolescent pretension. It was really just kind of based around what I was reading and thinking about at the time, I think.
Back when I found your comic, I commented on your site that it felt like a very dream-like story. Reading it is like having a dream while awake, and that's always how it felt to me.
Oh, cool. Yeah. I think that I was strangely uninterested in telling a story. I had a lot of moods that I wanted to capture, and I had a lot of ideas that really interested me, like the conflict between creation and destruction and all of these kind of big ideas, but I didn't really hang it around much of a story. I think that's why it has kind of a weird, slow, different feel, is just because my goal, whether right or wrong, wasn't really it wasn't to tell a story in the first place. It was just to capture a feeling, I guess. I'm glad that it kind of worked out a little bit, at least, because a dreamlike mood is one of the things I really wanted to capture, I think.
So now you have finished drawing your comic, and in your last update you mentioned how you've learned that it's probably not a good idea to write a script and have it entirely finished, and then embark on a 4-year-long drawing project. And I could really relate to this, because I'm currently drawing a comic which I scripted when I was 21, and I'm 27 now, and I am halfway through the story. So...
Oh, man. No, I really came to dislike a lot of the project, unfortunately, because I started it... Let's see, I think I was around 24 when I was getting the idea down. I really finished writing it when I was about 27, and now I'm 33. So you kind of are working with a fossil when you've written a script 5 years previous, and you're still kind of glued to it because you get to grow and change as an artist, but you don't get as much of a chance to grow and change as a writer if you're just working on the writing you did when you were a kid. That said, I am very glad I did the project, and I think I really improved as an artist, which is one of my main goals. But it did mean that throughout the project, I really had to reimagine why I was working on it and why I wanted to stick with it. I started this because I loved these ideas, and I loved kind of pretentious sci-fi or like moody sci-fi, and I wanted to give it a try writing some of my own. But then later on, when it just didn't seem to have the direction I wanted, then I had to find other reasons to keep going. Like I started experimenting with art styles that I hadn't tried before, just because I wanted to try to keep things fresh and to learn new things as I worked on the project. So it just took a lot more creativity than if I had been writing as I drew and I could really let the project grow in a different way.
That could create yet different trap, because when I was younger, I would come up with a story idea, start drawing a comic, and then completely run out of ideas. I don't know. I think even though I am currently stuck in this huge project where I scripted it a long, long time ago and I have since changed as a person, I worry that if I started doing it the other way around and just start with the idea of and a finished script, then I would probably just draw myself into a corner or not know how to finish the story that I started.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem because you can get into a trap of just going on tangents or the story's going too slow and you have pacing issues. But I think finding a middle ground might be the way to make it more sustainable where, I have an outline of where I want to go, but it's pretty loosey-goosey and I could take it in a few different directions, but there is a sense of direction that I could stick to. I don't know, but all I do know is that the last project I did was a very difficult project for me to complete and at times a very unsatisfying project to keep working on. So I think just finding anything to shake things up for me is what I'm interested in doing.
Your changing attitude towards Age of Clay, was that also the reason why you changed the update schedule? Because I think you had a really traditional webcomic update schedule. I think you were updating 3 times a week or something like that. And then you started posting big batches of pages, and not just what people usually do, like 3-4 pages at once, but these huge batches of pages every few months.
I switched the schedule because I was having difficulty keeping up interest in the project, and I really couldn't sustain it when I was updating just twice a week. I really wanted to turn my attention to some other things, so I found it much easier to put the comic aside for long stretches and then return to it when I had a free moment, rather than doing a 2 times a week update schedule where I really had to devote a good deal of time throughout the week to the comic, which just was quite difficult, especially because I was putting so much time into those pages and I really needed to focus on, making some money and having income and such. So it didn't make sense to spend the same amount of time on those pages that I was spending on them. But I would recommend that to people who are trying to finish webcomics, to just shake things up as much as possible just so you can get through it, because I do think the most important thing is finishing the project.
Yeah. And did you worry at any point that going on breaks would make you feel like, you know what, I don't want to go back to that project anymore, I'll just work on things that I actually enjoy?
I certainly toyed with that idea. And, it really is kind of an open question whether that would have been the right thing to do for me, I think. What I would love long term is to be able to make work like Age of Clay or something similar, kind of what I do for most of my time. And I'd love to be able to make money off of it. I don't think Age of Clay was ever going to be that project. It's, I guess, too niche and odd. And I took a lot of digressions in my art style. But I'd like to someday try to turn this into something I can maybe monetize a bit more, or something that could add to my other income a bit, like starting a Patreon and telling a story that's a bit more universally appealing. So I did toy with the idea of dropping the project just because I wasn't getting one of the main things I really hope to work towards in my career from that project, which doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the project. It's just the project wasn't linking up with my goals. So maybe I would have left it be, but I don't necessarily think that's bad. I think when you're working on a project like this, you really have to assess your own goals and how they're matching up with the project itself, and then you can act accordingly. I don't think there's anything wrong with dropping a project depending on the circumstances.
When you decided to abandon the traditional webcomic update schedule, did you worry that you might lose readers? Because I found your webcomic through an ad that you ran on Project Wonderful, so you did care about building up an audience and having people read your comics. So did you worry about this, or did you just think that you have to do whatever you have to do to finish the story? It doesn't matter who reads it and who doesn't.
Well, I think in my case, I had some lovely people reading my comic, and I got really nothing but support from people throughout the entire run of my comic. People were very kind. But I did not have much of an audience, and I didn't even when I advertised. I mean, my comic was quite strange, and I don't think it appealed to very many people, which is totally fine. That's just the way it went. But I had so few audience members that I figured the people who really liked the comic, would find their way to it, especially if I provided like update information on a mailing list. But there were so few readers that I figured, it was really okay to just do this on my terms and get it done on my terms, because I didn't feel like I was really letting too many people down if a regular update schedule didn't work. I think if I had really pushed to monetize my comic more, like if I had had a Patreon, and if I had people who were really paying for a service I was providing, I would have definitely thought twice. But this was kind of very much just a personal project. And so really it was more about just making it work and getting through. I just didn't worry about the readers that much. Maybe if I had had more of them.
I see. And I have to say that I really liked the strangeness of your story. Some people definitely appreciated it, so...
Oh yeah, I think that some people really liked it. I mean, definitely. They were very... I had a lot of really kind readers. I'd say that it just wasn't a story for everyone, is a good way to put it. In a way that really makes me happy. I like working on something that's kind of unique to me and unique to my interests. But I had always struggled with the fact that this was a personal project that reflected a lot of my own interests and seemed to appeal to a small group of people, but appealed to that group very powerfully, versus really wanting to reach more people and to appeal to more people and to get a wider audience, partly so I could make a little bit more money, but then also just because that's kind of the point of art, is to really communicate with a large group of people. So there was always a tension there for me, which is why I think in my next project I would go in a different direction.
Well, that was another great interview, and with us now are some members of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective who are going to discuss some of the long-term projects they're working on and the ways that they've sustained their interest in these projects over the long term. With us here are Jen Zyren Smith.
Hello, I'm Jen Zyren Smith. I write the webcomic LaSalle's Legacy, and it's a pirate adventure comic about two brothers learning about family.
Also with us is Sophie Pfrötzschner.
Hello, I'm Sophie, and I make the comic Soul's Journey, in which a prince is trapped in a wolf's body.
And Kristen Kiomall-Evans.
Hi, I'm Kristen Kiomall-Evans, and I make the webcomic 12 of Magic and Muses, found at xiicomic.com. It's a story about magical girls and pulling back the curtain that society wants to hide you in until it can't.
One of the parts of the interview that interested me, and I think is a great starting point, is that writing and art develop parallel to each other when you're doing a comic, especially in a long-form comic, like what most of the members of the SF community do. And one of the pieces of advice that she gave was we ought not to go too far ahead with the script in order to avoid outrunning the development of the artwork. That if you have a script all at once at the beginning, it sort of ossifies, and you have this thing that sort of turns the artwork into a years-long chore to catch up with the script. Do you think that there's truth to that? How do you feel about that? Sophie, why don't you start?
Yeah, definitely. I personally script like a chapter ahead with the detailed script, and even then I sometimes change things on the fly. And while I have my outline for the entire story, I try not to get too specific with the end, so I can change things up if I feel like it. I mean, if I was glued to a script, I don't think I'd keep on with this comic.
I actually feel the complete opposite way. So when I started my webcomic, I actually did a 46 chapter draft, all completed before I started script work. And my process is just throwing out ideas. So even though I have this 46 giant monster script, I usually don't necessarily adhere to it. So for instance, there's been some chapters where I've gotten all the way to pencil work and then in the inking stage have destroyed those pages or panels and just rewrote them, which is saying something because I have like 800 pages inked right now, but I only have finished like about 100 of them. So for me, going back and changing things to the story has been, I think, much easier with a large buffer. So I'm definitely not saying that my advice is something that should be taken by anybody unless you have like several years where you're okay being a no one.
I'm kind of in the middle. When I did my first webcomic, I had the beginning planned out and the end planned out, but I didn't have the middle planned out. So I'm like, oh, when I get to that, it'll be fine. And then I got to the middle and it was not fine. So I learned that I really do need to have at least some good sense of structure, especially in the middle part, so that I don't get lost. And then I am a discovery writer, so I do discover things when I write, but at the same time, I do need to have that, at least a basic plan in mind. So I try to at least have a good sense of what the structure is going to be, and I just allow myself to change it if something happens to come up. I do write a script a chapter ahead, but I do have a huge outlining everything, like especially a major story arc, so that I don't come to something and say, oh no, what do I do now?
Well, I think that's an interesting way of going about it. That's fairly similar to my own. I don't actually write scripts, but I do have an outline that I've written so that I know ahead of time, I do know what all of the parts of the story that I'm writing are and where they're going. But I don't ever write page for page exactly what people are going to say because I feel like it sort of binds me into something that I may not want to go for later. Like you can paint yourself into a corner, write your own prison around you. So I mean, there is a possibility that you can go the complete opposite way, which is sort of the Chester Gould path, which, if you know who Chester Gould was, he wrote Dick Tracy back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and he never wrote more than one strip in advance. And his theory was that that kept it fresh and made it so that people wouldn't know what was going to happen next, and then readers would keep coming back.
For me, it was that I had some comic projects before where I really I was a pantser. I just drew what I thought was a good thing to continue the story. And I drew and wrote myself into corners left and right. So yeah, the outline was very important for this comic. I need at least a chapter in advance so I know where things are heading and I can just put in elements, foreshadowing and such. But yeah, I don't like to tie myself down to the specifics just now when I know that I only get to them in like 4 or 5 years. Because by then my ideas of what might happen could have changed.
I have an animation background, so like essentially being told that you're going to work on a crunchy schedule and things are going to change all the time until like you start doing the finishing things definitely helped. But it's always good to like have, for me personally, a full finished script to work off of, just because I need to know that I can keep throwing out ideas and I need to know that I won't hit a wall by looking at a blank page. As long as that script is done, there's something for me as a leaping off point. Just like how in animation, it'll be like someone wrote a storyboard and then I can like break that storyboard apart if I'm having a bad day and not knowing how to keep going. My process definitely lets me not stop, which is why I really appreciate working the way I do. It doesn't make it any less like emotionally draining, but as long as I know that I can keep moving forward, I know that the comic will be finished.
It's definitely a good safety net in case you just really don't know what else you could change or how to go forward?
Yeah, for me, I think I need to have at least the outline. I have done things where I have changed entire pages because suddenly I had a better idea. And I've been at the inking stage and like, this isn't working and I've had to redo the script. But for me, at least if I have that outline, it's easier to edit than it is to create. So I feel that at least if I have an outline and a script, it's a jumping off point, and I can always deviate from that if the story needs it or if something else comes up. And I'm comfortable with that. That also leaves it open for me not getting sort of bored with it because I can always change it, and I feel I can always change it.
Yeah, for sure. Especially working on a project with no prior experience in specific webcomics. Taking as long as I did on the scripts and giving each one like the kind of care it did to incubate definitely helped me become a better writer because I simply had to keep rewriting things over and over and over and over again, which is really the only way you get good at anything.
Well, that brings us back to one of the points made in the interview. Do you think that it's important to develop art and writing at the same time, parallel to each other? Do you think that coming at it with one or the other fully developed gives you an advantage or a disadvantage?
I like to have at least some sort of a style, but if you have like a huge webcomic, like mine is over 800 pages now, the style is going to change because your art is going to change. And I think if you feel locked into a certain style, then you start getting bored. Like I experienced that a little bit in the middle of a webcomic where I was trying desperately just to stick with one complete style, and after a while I knew when I was drawing I was getting bored with it, so I allowed myself to just change as needed. And I figured, well, if I print it, I'll just look over it and try to make it at least look somewhat similar. But I think for webcomics, you're looking at a person's body of work over a number of years, especially a long-term webcomic, so the art is going to change because you're going to change as an artist. And I just sort of accept that and allow myself to sort of change the art and the writing alongside of it whenever it needs to be changed or whenever I feel like I need a challenge.
That's a lot of like how I feel about the whole process. And one of the things that got me wanting to do a webcomic was, for one thing, the story I wanted to write would have killed animators across the world. But I also I found webcomics almost allowed you to grow as an artist over time and like let you change. And it wasn't like a dramatic change with a lot of classic Cape comics where you'll have an artist on one issue and then suddenly another artist will take over. Even something as old as like Girls with Slingshots, like you can see how she started removing detail and getting faster, and Daniel Corsetto like was building on her own things and you could see her fundamentals change. And even though it was like a simple gag comic, you can like as an artist like sit back and be like, there is a lot of discipline in these comics that I don't think a lot of people appreciate. But me as a newbie coming in was like, I can totally like dissect different parts of what she was learning, which is a really fun process for me.
Yeah, I think the moment you start a project that will span a few years, both art and writing will develop, and you just can't change that. And I think that's something that you have to embrace. I mean, that's the cool thing about webcomics. You learn as you go, and by the end you will have a product that you hopefully like.
You know, that's a point that's come up in other discussions that I've had about webcomics in general. That's actually an advantage of the webcomic format in that not only is there sort of an expectation that it's going to change because people are learning as they do it, it gives you sort of the freedom to change. You can anticipate that that's going to happen. I mean, if you look at the earliest pages of my comic versus what I'm doing now, I mean, I think I've gotten a lot more sophisticated than what I was doing before. And just in terms of simple things like giving myself permission to experiment with different kinds of lighting styles and different color palettes. My color palette has gotten a lot less sort of forced and weird looking, and now it's kind of getting more normalized. The range of colors is getting more narrow as I go on. You're learning to make a comic by making a comic, and if you can see it that way, it can help you sustain your interest in it over time because it becomes an opportunity rather than something that you sort of have to do. which is another point that is important to explore, I think. Is there a point at which it becomes a chore? How do you know when that's happening? Like, what do you think might be the warning signs when you're starting to lose interest in a comic? And do you want to push through that, or does it sort of become something that you have to overcome?
I once started a short story which was supposed to be this super epic dinosaur thing with prey versus predator. I mean, I was young, but I did the prologue and thought, oh god, this thing is going to be such a time sink. I don't know where to fit it in. I don't even know where this is going, actually. And I just ended it with a prologue, and then the asteroid came. But
If that's not a Deus Ex Machina, I don't know what is.
it literally came from the sky.
I was writing this story, but then an asteroid collided with the planet. So the end.
So yeah, I ended this comic like, okay, no, it's done, it's finished. It's sitting there in my old Animex account, and nobody is reading it, but yeah. That was when I thought, oh, that's such a time sink, and I don't have that time right now, and I don't even know if I'm going to be invested in it. So I ended it when I had the opportunity. So yeah, asteroid.
So there's definitely been points in this long, epic haul that I've put myself into, especially over such a long time. There's definitely been serious low points with like death of family members, and like I do suffer from depression, so like there are whole bouts of like pull yourself out of bed and just like look at your tablet and keep drawing. And I think just the fact that like I had such a strong backing was the only thing that kept me going forward. I definitely find when I don't have a strong structure, it's really easy for me to lose track of a project and just drop it. So I've been trying to enforce the same similar structure on smaller projects, which has been really good to start building my repertoire and doing the style changes. But there was definitely a long haul where I wasn't working on anything else that essentially just made this whole thing feel like such a slog. And you can definitely tell in certain, at least I can tell, that in certain spots the art isn't as detailed, and I've just kind of like thrown together backgrounds. I mean, even recently I looked at the whole thing and said, you know what, I'm just going to cut out a whole ton of chapters because this is long for me to make and it's long for people to read, and maybe cutting back a little bit might be a good idea, even though some of these pages have already hit the inked stage. But it's a long learning process, and there are definitely like whole times where it's like you just kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other. There's like no love for it. But there are other projects that I've worked on that have just like fallen to the wayside and disappeared, and most of it had to do with the fact that like they either didn't have a strong enough background for me to care about to keep going, or I realized that I wasn't doing it for me, which was also a big thing. They were uninteresting to me. I realized I was doing them for someone else, even past me. I was doing them for past me, which didn't feel appropriate for me, who I am now, to keep going.
Yeah, I've also had bouts where when I'm drawing it, I can kind of feel the automation coming in. Like I'm just doing it because I have to do it and I have to produce pages because I have the deadline. And what I've found over the years is that every chapter now is a way for me to experiment artistically. And I focus on one thing that I'm going to experiment on artistically. And that's actually kept me more interested, because then, since I allow myself to do it, even sometimes page by page, I find myself that, I'm not feeling like it's a long slog, like it's something that I have to do. And I think a lot of that happens in the middle too, when you don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, because I'm almost done. So now I'm really fired up trying to finish the comic. But before, when I was like in the middle chapters, there was a lot of that, doing it because I just felt like it needed to get done. And it was interesting, but it was also just something that I felt that I just needed to do because I needed to finish it. Because my previous webcomic, I didn't finish, and I dropped it because life got in the way and I just never went back. And then for this one, I was determined to finish it. Sometimes also just reconnecting with other artists. I had some other artist friends. I would talk to them about it. That also re-sparked interest in my work, in my comic, because they were interested, and then I got re-interested in my comic. Which also can help buoy you in those times of where you're like, oh my goodness, this is so long, it's taking forever. So
Yeah, community can definitely not be underestimated when working on a long haul project.
Definitely.
Do you fear that it's possible to run out of ideas? I don't. There are two schools of thought on the idea. I mean, I guess we're talking about writer's block when you talk about that, or art block, if that's the equivalent. I sort of decline to believe in writer's block as a thing that happens. You can do good work or you can do bad work, but you sort of have to stay at the table. There's nothing that you can do that can come out so broken that it can't be fixed later. There's no reason that you can't do a finished page and say, well, really, that was just a very advanced sketch, But I know that feelings that people have about their work are very real, and Kristen, you mentioned that you have problems with depression. I think everybody does too, but perhaps not in the clinical sense. It's a natural part of the artistic mindset, I think, to be concerned about that.
I think that writers on art blog is often a symptom. Like you are not satisfied with your story, you think something's missing, and you just can't see what it is. It's a perfect opportunity to re-examine it and maybe find other ways that motivate you again to move forward. But then again, there's also like when you're really having a clinical depression and just can't get out of bed or something like that, then I wouldn't say force it.
Yeah, like I can usually tell the difference between art block and depression. It usually focuses on like, is it just the project suffering or is it everything else in my life suffering at the same time? Typically when I get depressed, like the only thing I can do is nothing. And that's much different from art block. My view on art block personally is very much similar to, I can't remember his name right now, but the gentleman who does the oatmeal said creativity is like breathing, where you have to intake as much as you exhale. When you yourself are a creative person, you're continuously exhaling everything you've ever internalized. So when you hit an art block, that's basically your sign that you're not internalizing enough other people's creativity enough. So when I hit that stage, I know that even though I have a script to work on and I'm starting to get miserable because I'm disappointed with it, that's when I usually start back and be like, okay, I need to like watch movies that I haven't watched before. I need to go to an art gallery. I need to go to the zoo and draw animals. I need to storyboard a quick little project or just binge read other people's webcomics for the next week and a half, which is very much part of my process because it's important to remember nobody's ideas are new, and a good artist is a good thief.
I've noticed that a lot of times my art block is more of a perfection block. Like, I have ideas, but then I don't think those ideas are good ideas. And so I tell myself like, oh, well, I can't work on this because it's not a good idea. Or I get stuck at the page because there have been days where I'm sketching and nothing's really working, and it's easier for me to sort of go on that down spiral of, oh my goodness, I'm never going to be good again. Where did my art go? All this stuff going in my head. But reality is it's mostly like my perfectionism coming out. Like I need it to be perfect every single time. When I allow myself to say, okay, this is going to be a crappy first draft, I'm just going to make myself a crappy first draft. I can fix it later. Or when I get to the sketchbook, I'm like, these are just going to be crappy sketches. I allow myself the freedom to just experiment and play. I find that the art block goes away because that perfectionism is gone. It's like I don't expect myself to make something really good. I just expect myself to create.
I think that the interaction that you're having with your readers can help a lot too. My audience is small but very engaged. That's sort of what keeps me going. Like I feel a certain responsibility to that. Conventional wisdom says that when you're doing a comic on a weekly basis, or whatever regular schedule you set, you ought to build up a buffer and be ahead of your update schedule. But I never am, mainly because the sort of week-to-week feedback is how I motivate myself to continue with the work. Only working 1 week at a time, knowing that people, whoever they are, however small or large the audience may be, people are waiting for that to come up, that helps me a lot because it makes me feel responsible to them in a way that keeps me moving forward. How do you guys feel about the interaction with your audience? Audiences can be fickle on one side, and on the other side, building an audience is there's no way of guaranteeing that you're going to have the kind of audience you imagine you're going to have. So that interaction isn't ever really a guarantee.
My audience personally is very tiny and not very engaged, which is, fine. Like, there's plenty of people that just want to read, and that's totally cool. So I don't want any of my fans to think that I'm, like, upset with them. I also see a lot of artists get into that trap where they think they have to start curtailing to the demands of their audience simply because maybe someone threw an idea out there. And so suddenly an artist feels this anxiety that they have to start following another plan, or you get an audience that doesn't quite read as well as you'd like them to, like missing giant, massive clues or forgetting panels and stuff like that, and then getting upset. It's important to understand, like, who you're writing for, which is another reason why I wanted to do a big buffer, was because I didn't want someone else's influence to derail me from what was supposed to be for myself. So an audience can be a double-edged sword, and you really have to, like, prepare yourself and know a little bit about yourself before you start looking at your project and the demands of said audience.
Yeah, I think my audience is also pretty small. There are some that are more engaged than others, but they've always been really good and really have really good comments for me. So every time I get a comment about the work, it's sort of that extra boost, as it were. It's like, yes, I'm on the right page. I'm actually communicating correctly. Somebody else is feeling the feelings that I feel when I make the comic. But there is also that I've never gotten a troll, but I've had some friends who've had trolls. And I've seen those trolls take those friends down, and the friends just don't work on their comic anymore. And so I think you do have to try not to let the trolls get to you, because, there's always going to be somebody who doesn't like your work. I haven't had that experience yet, but I've seen other people sort of get derailed by that. And I think ultimately, you have to remember that you're making it for yourself, and it's good that if you have an audience to connect to. And I think you're sort of also making it for an audience as well, but not letting the audience control you. Keep them in mind because you want to communicate your idea, but also remember that it is your idea and your story, and how you want to tell it is for you.
Yeah, well, I personally think that I'd make Sword's Journey even just for myself if I had no audience, and mine is pretty small, I'd say. I think getting this comment that somebody really reads your comic and understands it in a similar way that you intend it to be understood, that's a huge external motivator to go forward.
I think that those are all really good points. The interaction is important, but don't let it dominate you. And if you can't love the work for its own merits, then it's going to become a problem for you to do it consistently over time. If you can't love the thing that you're doing yourself, and you feel like other people aren't really loving it either, then why do it? It becomes the sort of the question that rises in people's minds. And I've seen a lot of really great comics just sort of die off that way because people felt like they weren't getting the kind of feedback that they wanted. They weren't getting the kind of interaction that they wanted with the audience. And I think that was a sign that they didn't really have the kind of connection with their own work that they wanted as well. Either they did it for the wrong reasons or they got bored with it. And, those are legitimate reasons to stop doing something, if it's not something that you really love anymore.
Yeah, if you want to be like a famous person and get like a ton of readers, but then you're only doing it for your readers, if you're always chasing the readers and trying to give them what they want, your audience doesn't know what they want. I don't ever know what I want except for in my own work. So chasing that is it's a zero-sum game, because you're never going to please everybody. Your audience really doesn't know what they want until you give it to them. And so I think that you have to have the internal motivation, say, this is the story I want to tell. And, you want to share it with the world, but you have to be true to yourself and your vision.
I'm definitely going to take a bit of time for a small confession. Working on a project for like 3+ years, and then finally dropping that first page in front of everyone, and then like just kind of sounds like a wet fart. Doesn't it can be a little like it could be a little disheartening for sure, because it's like, oh, I made this epic webcomic that's going to be this long and it's already almost done, and then it's just like, here's the first page, everyone, and everyone just kind of looks at you and it's like, and it's like, well,
so what have you done for me lately?
Yeah, it's like what do I do now? So Try and keep your expectations a little lower than you think that you need to. I was that person who was making a webcomic for 3 years with nothing to show for it. And we all know people who are always writing a book or writing a screenplay and have been writing that same screenplay for 15 years. Not to say that some projects don't take time, but there are people that like make things, and then there are people who continually wish to make things and don't make things. So sometimes when you've been working like that and then you finally have something to show for it, there's a little bit of a hurdle to get people to understand that it's done. You can see it now. Look at it. It's actually finished. This thing that I was talking about for years is actually like a thing you can look at.
And then there's the thing, you said your comic was 40 plus chapters. I think if you say that up front to an audience and you just drop the first page, they're just skeptical if you actually get to the end of it. I mean, there are so many webcomics out there that just peter out and then never to be heard of again. So people are cautious.
With like every right to be, because there are hundreds of dead webcomics out there.
Yes. And that graveyard is growing.
You know, there's always a little bit of naivete that comes with a new project, especially when you've never like used before.
It doesn't just happen to bad webcomics. It happens to really good webcomics too. You know, there are a lot of really good dead webcomics out there. So you have to prepare yourself to confront limitations like that and to have strategies to get past them. And I think also remember that people want to see the beginning, the middle, and the end of your comic when you're putting it out there. So keep that in mind. There can be a strong temptation to drop a project that's a long-term project if it no longer feels satisfying. But the people to whom it is satisfying find it that way because they want to see it keep going. And they're rooting for you, you know. We're rooting for you, your fellow artists. So finish, you know. You might as well see it through. It's only when it's done that you'll really be able to assess whether it was successful or not. Until then, it's still happening. So how do you know what's going to become of it? You might as well just see it through.
Yeah, when I stopped my first webcomic, I did have one person tell me they really enjoyed it and they were sad to see it go. And then I felt a little bit of guilt because I wasn't going to continue it. I wasn't able to continue it anyway, but there will be people out there who want to see you finish. They may not be the ones that write you all the time, but you have readers, you have an audience, and I think it would be nice if you can give them the ending that you at least had planned for this long-term project.
Yeah, I read a lot of webcomics too, and whenever some of them just end or get permanently hiatused, it's disappointing. But I can understand the creators. I mean, making a webcomic myself, I know how much work it is and how much energy you have to put into it. But it's still disappointing to not get it like you hoped you would get it till the end.
And like I would like to put out there that even when you start to get like tired in a project, as an audience viewer, even if the project ends abruptly, but there is some sort of like catharsis to the ending of any project, can give a lot to your audience and is important to look at, especially in like TV shows where there isn't a lot of like actual like storyline through. Audiences always tend to appreciate like a goodbye episode. It's important to take that lesson because like then everyone isn't hanging on this indefinite hiatus that you may not have told them about. It's a goodbye, you can move on, and I'm going to work on a new project, which also gets people more interested in your next project because they know that even if you might not have finished it satisfyingly, you at least give them the notice that it's over. And there's something incredibly powerful in that, even if it's not ended on the best note.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. This program is a production of the Spiderforest Webcomic Collective. Our executive producer is Christina Major, and Eva is our showrunner and our audio engineer. The Spiderforest Webcomic Collective is a creator-owned organization funded by voluntary contributions from our members and from readers and listeners like you. Thanks for your support. To learn more about the collective, our members, and our projects, or to make a donation, go to spiderforest.com. I'd like to thank Katherine Jameson for joining us for this episode. You can read her completed comic, Age of Clay, at ageofclaycomic.com. Thanks also to Eva for bringing us that interview. I'd also like to thank our members who participated in this episode's discussion, Jen Zyren Smith, Sophie Pfrötzschner, and Kristen Kiomall-Evans. Jen makes the comic LaSalle's Legacy. You can read it at lasalleslegacy.com. Sophie makes the comic Soul's Journey. You can read it at soulsjourney.garitianchronicles.com. Kristen makes the comic 12 of Magic and Muses. You can read it at xiicomic.com. Ewa makes the comic Bits Fair. You can read it at bitsfair.com. And I make the comic Six Commando. You can read it at viciousprint.com/sixcommando. I'm Mathieu Moyen. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
800 pages, that's insane.
Yeah. It's a large story.
In a good way, I think.